Hi guys, what is going on? And welcome back to another video on Conqueror's Blade. So today we're going to be taking a look at looking at all the different hero weapon classes. I've done a few videos on this kind of in the past, but have had quite a few people ask to see if we can do an updated version of this. And yeah, I thought it was about time we actually kind of tackled this. We're just going to head over to Tier Maker, take a little bit of a look and break down sort of what are the top meta classes at the moment, what kind of are languishing a little bit at the bottom, and what's sort of sitting a little bit in the middle. I guess a few caveats before we get into this. This is mostly directed towards siege battles, not territory war, because they do change slightly for things like that. I mean, for example, short sword, okay, is actually still very good in siege battles, but is obviously a very, very dominant and very, very prominent class that you'll see a lot of in territory wars. I'm not going to be ranking it based on its territory war standing, but on how it performs in siege battles. Arguably, you could try and do some sort of hybrid between the two, but I think most beginning players aren't going to be immediately getting involved in territory wars. It's a pretty end game content, and this is more directed at players who are more recently joining the game. I also think it's worth saying that it's obviously always a little bit controversial ranking people's weapons, because some people become very attached to certain weapon classes. Just because a weapon sort of isn't necessarily the super on-trend or super meta weapon at the moment, doesn't mean you can't do incredibly well with it. There are players with bad classes that are very good players in those classes and manage to make them really work for them. I'm ranking it based on how in general it performs across siege battles, how most of the community reacts and is able to play with it, and so we're talking really about bulk averages. Just because you do really well with a class that I might say isn't all that great at the moment, doesn't mean that you can't perform really well with that class and it works great for you. It's also to remember that new players, you can always change weapon. Don't get too caught up in the first weapon you pick. You can change it quite easily. You get one free weekly attribute point reset now. You don't even have to use personal histories anymore, so you can change your stats around to suit different classes, and obviously you can move between the weapons pretty freely. So don't get too caught up in it. Don't worry too much about picking your weapon at the start of the game. Go with whatever you fancy, because you can always change later on. Okay, let's hop over to the tier maker. So here we are over on tier maker now. I decided to break this down into 3 sections: top tier, mid tier, and bottom tier. I know you could put it over 5 or 6 sections, but realistically, I don't think we need to make it that complicated. And it's actually quite hard to split them. And I think if you have lots of sections, I'll be here all day trying to make a decision about where I think everything should go. So we're just going to work through these now, give a brief explanation of each one. I'm sure some of you will end up disagreeing with me. It's kind of hard because, particularly with runes having been introduced now in Season 7, that provides certain buffs to certain classes, and runes have certainly benefited some classes more than others. For example, the Musket has done particularly well out of the rune changes. But these runes only last for Season 7, and then we're going to have a whole new set at the start of Season 8, and the old ones will be disappearing. So do we factor these in or not when we're considering the ranking of different units and different heroes? So I'm kind of just going to have to try and make an educated decision in that regard, but I'll try and explain as I'm working my way through. So obviously for number 1, short sword and shield. A really dominant class. It's all about its tank, the fact it's got iron sides, its survivability. It also has quite a good amount of stun, particularly on its ultimate, which means even though as a hero its damage output isn't that high, it dominates not only territory wars but siege battles in the sense that it can just control the situation with CC and survivability, meaning that the player can continue to control their unit after most other heroes will be dead because they'll still be alive. And in the game at the moment, once you're dead, your ability to control your unit other than to attack or retreat is very, very limited. So staying alive is really kind of important. And so for that reason, I think short sword has got to be a top tier class at the moment. You see it played quite a lot in sieges, and for very good reason, because it's a really decent class. That takes us on to glaive, the weapon that actually I use predominantly the most of the time. You'll see if you watch one of my videos for the past sort of 3 or 4 months, I've been playing glaive. I really like the glaive. It has great damage potential. I'm using it with medium armor and full strength to really maximize that damage at the expense of my survivability. I'm quite a fragile class. I'm quite easily killed. If I get caught out of position, as I'm sure you've seen in some of my videos, I die very, very quickly. I think the glaive is in a good position, but I don't think it's necessarily comparable to something like a short sword. And so for that tier, I think it's going to drop into the mid tier. I think it would be upper mid tier, maybe lower top tier, if we were to split it into lots of different rankings. Definitely a very solid class. And particularly early on, if you're just starting the game, I think you'll find it very enjoyable because it has a good amount of AoE, high damage against units and heroes, which makes it a very versatile class and probably one that a lot of people will enjoy. That leads us on to dual blades. One of the more controversial classes in the game. A lot of people really hate fighting against dual blades. You know, it has obviously the invisibility, which makes it quite hard to counter. And a high tier veteran dual blades player will be able to lock you down and kill you very, very quickly. But it starts to become very dependent on gear craft, particularly the craft of the weapon itself. If you can get big modifying stats on it, then that can make a real big difference because a lot of its damage is percentage modification on its skills. So that means that lower tier players and newer players going up against heavy armor players can sometimes struggle a bit as a dual blades, but equally, then when you get a more veteran player, you'll find that dual blades can actually cut through high tier heavy armor players very, very effectively. So how useful is it as a unit? It does struggle a bit in terms of pushing points. It is light armor. Yes, it's great for hero killing, pretty terrible at unit killing. It's got a bit of a specialized role, can be very effective, but does it really help you push points? Does it really help you take that final point? It can be a little bit more difficult, in my opinion, than some of the classes. So for that tier reason, I think it drops into the mid tier. Still a very, very viable class. And if you're into sort of stealth, being almost a ninja, then that is certainly going to be the class for you. So we then go on to Longbow, or just Bow as it's actually called in game. I've always called it Longbow. A lot of people call it Longbow because we've got Shortbow, I suppose. Longbow has suffered a lot over the past couple of seasons. It got a massive, massive nerf a couple of seasons ago, which basically added stamina drain to it, which really limited its potential damage output. And there was been a few sort of nudges back towards being more viable in more recent times, but it certainly isn't there at the moment, and it's certainly not a particularly great class. You don't see many longbows on the battlefield at the moment, and for good reason, because it is still struggling a bit. I suspect at some point we'll slowly see some more buffs come towards it, and it might start to move up. But for now, unfortunately, it's going to have to be dropping in down at the bottom tier because it's just not that much of a viable class. That leads us on to the Maul. And this is the only seasonal weapon, or actually the only hero weapon that has been introduced since the start of the game. It was introduced back in Season 3, and actually to play the Maul, you've got to go back and do your Season 3 Maul challenges. If you're wondering how you want to unlock this, then yeah, you need to be pressing F5, go into your unit challenges, moving it back from, well, currently Season 7, but depends when you actually watch this video, all the way back to Season 3, and then you can actually start to unlock the Maul challenges, and you'll get the Maul skills unlocked, and you can equip and use this as a weapon. It's a very dominant weapon in the game at the moment. I think it sometimes gets a little bit overhyped. It's very high damage, but it is stunnable. It does have a stun recovery, but it doesn't have a lot of CC against anyone else, which is kind of its limitation. The grab is probably the most annoying element of it. I don't think the grab is necessarily particularly overpowered, it's just not very fun to fight against. And so for that reason, it's quite a hated class, and I can kind of understand why. It's certainly very frustrating when you get grabbed and it feels like you have no control over your own destiny as you get flung into a unit of 4 to Braccio. So, Maul is a very effective class. It is very highly damaging, and I think for that reason, it probably has to drop into the top tier because it's the only one that really has that block breakthrough. Wow, that's a tongue twister of a set of words. It's the only one that can fly into the unit of stalwart swinging and actually just break through and smash the unit to pieces. No other class can really do that. No other class has that raw damage that the Maul does, and that's really what makes it very dominant. So that takes us on to the Musket. And this is a class that has had some pretty extreme buffs from the runes this season. It was already a very good class prior, but now it's had some pretty amazing runes to it, from standard shot now being grape shot, some big buffs to its bomb damage, which means that it can put out some phenomenal amounts of damage, actually at pretty decent ranges. Its standard shot causes stun on enemy heroes, and yeah, as I say, the fact it can pretty well wipe out an enemy hero within a few shots, and it can do that almost instantly, particularly when combined with its bomb, means that it's got to be a top tier weapon. I personally expect we shall see some changes to the musket fairly soon. Whether that will be a direct nerf or a change to some of the runes possibly, but we'll kind of just have to watch this space on this one. So depending on when you're watching this video, this may have changed slightly. I suspect there is going to come some changes to it, but at the moment, it's not. It's a very, very dominant class, and it's certainly one that you should be taking a look at and considering. So from there, we go on to the Nagachi. Again, quite an interesting class, certainly one that a lot of players get drawn into because who doesn't like samurais? Although, unbelievably, we've still not had a Japanese season, which I'm sure we will do at some point. How effective is the Nagachi? Well, the short answer is not very. A lot of players will initially quite enjoy it because once you're below level 60, you're often fighting fairly low armoured enemy units. Plus, you're also fighting relatively lightly armoured enemy heroes. And that means its high slashing damage is quite effective and it can actually be quite a damaging weapon. But then once you start to get into sort of thrown into the full scale matchmaking, you'll start to encounter much heavily armoured units and more heavily armoured heroes, and you'll start to find that your damage really starts to tail off. On top of that, you're going to be a medium armour user. That means you really don't have the tank and survivability of some of the higher tier classes. So it's sort of like a glaive, a medium armor glaive. You've got all the vulnerability of the class that I'm playing at the moment, but without any of the real burst damage that the class gets. And for that reason, it's going to have to drop into the bottom tier. It has had a few decent runes this season, which has certainly helped it. Maybe we're starting to nudge up to sort of the bottom of mid tier, but realistically, I think it's going to still be a class that most people aren't going for. That leads us on to the spear. Now, the spear's actually had a nerf at the start of Season 7, a change to the way its AoE works, and actually spears sort of suffered a little bit for nerfs for the past few seasons. It is still a very damaging class, and it's one of those classes that has some intense amounts of burst damage. And it can really actually wipe out enemy heroes very, very quickly and very, very effectively. But with the nerfs, it is starting to drop down a little bit. It's perhaps not quite in such the dominant position that it once was. It is a medium armor, so it's quite a fragile class. Certainly one of those classes that once you really get the hang of the game, once you start to master how things work, then it starts to become a more viable class. For newer players, I think you'll find it quite a hard one to really be able to make proper use of. So for that reason, I'm going to throw it in at the mid tier. That leads us on to Polax. Actually, a class that I spent quite a lot of time playing, and actually one I'm giving some real serious consideration of actually going back to, because it is really quite an interesting class. It's had quite a few buffs. At the start of Season 6, it got some pretty decent damage buffs, in the sense that some of its attacks cause armor reduction on enemy heroes, which basically means it does more damage, in effect, because the enemies have less armor when they start getting hit by it. Also had some really nice runes this season, which has started to make it increasingly dominant. Polax, at the moment, is in a really nice place. And so I think it's just going to start to nudge up into top tier. I think it is only just, but with the runes it's had this season, and with the buffs that it's had in the past season or two, I think it makes it worthy of just nudging over the line into that top tier. That leads us on to Shortbow. Definitely much more viable than the Longbow at the moment. It has a lot of CC, so it means it can stun enemy heroes quite effectively and control the situation. It also has pretty decent amounts of damage, even though it has had a few changes and nerfs over the past season. It still can cut through sort of light and medium armor users really quite effectively. For example, if I come up against a decent Shortbow player in my medium armor glaive, I mean, he can absolutely cut me to pieces because I just don't have the armor protection to stand up to him. Against heavier armor users, it can start to be a little bit more difficult, but again, it depends a lot on the level of equipment and the player that's going to be using it. A very good high-level Shortbow player can probably really drag it up to the top tier, but I think realistically, most people that you're going to be encountering in siege battles, and if we were to take a bulk average of Shortbow players across the board, then I think that probably is going to throw it into the upper part of the mid-tier, and that's where I'm going to throw it today. Finally, that leads us to the longsword and shield. Definitely, a couple of seasons ago, I would have put this in at the bottom tier. It's always been an interesting class, and it does have some nice things, such as its self-heal. It's obviously a heavy armor, so it's quite tanky. It has a nice block because it has a shield, and it has many benefits in that sense, but its damage potential has been very low, and it just really wasn't a very effective class at changing the outcome of a battle. It didn't have the same level of CC as something like a short sword, so it couldn't really control the situation in the same way. It was always just sort of there, blocking in the background, occasionally healing. Yeah, it survives, but it doesn't really control the situation in any way. It has had a good couple of buffs over the past season, which has started to nudge it up. And I think for that, I'm going to just allow it to go into the mid-tier. But I think it probably is only just. It's certainly in the lower end of the mid-tier, but it is quite a beginner-friendly class because of the self-heal, because of the survivability aspect. It can be quite a nice one to learn on before you then progress on to a different class. So that's kind of what I've ended up with. I think a lot of these can probably sort of nudge up or down slightly depending on your own playstyle. Some people are definitely going to get on better with some classes than the others. I'm sure there's plenty of Nagachi players out there who could actually play their Nagachi really well and make it really viable. But across every Nagachi player, as a general rule, on average, it tends to struggle in most battles. And that's why I've put it down there. Obviously, on the flip, there are plenty of Musket players who couldn't hit a barn door if they were 2 meters away. Even though it's a top tier weapon, if you still miss, you still miss. So that's kind of what I mean when I say, a lot of it comes down to player skill above and beyond the class. And remember, you can always be changing weapons, so don't get caught up too much in the fact that one is one way or one is another. These are all movable, and you can always change class. Hopefully that's been useful and informative. If it has, do let me know what you think in the comments down below. Of course, if you have any questions, do let me know what you think. Do ask down below, and obviously I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching, guys, and I shall see you all on the next video.